Good morning. I'm Michelle Clifton-Soderstrom, Dean of the Faculty at North Park Theological Seminary and Director of the School of Restorative Arts at Stateville Correctional Center. I'm also a member of North Park Covenant Church, and it is my joy today to introduce our guest preacher, Pastor Alex Negron. I also extend a warm greeting to Alex's family and friends, and I just want to tell you we are so grateful for the gift of Pastor Alex in our community and our lives, and by extension you. So welcome. Pastor Alex is a third-year student in North Park's Master of Arts program in Ministry and Restorative Justice Practices. He's a writing assistant with North Park's Writing Center. He's author of the book The Forgotten Tales of El Capitan, which you can get on Amazon. And he's written and published numerous articles on anything from the power of collaborative writing to biblical commentating, liberation theology, and devotional works for the larger Covenant Ministerium. To his loved ones, Alex is a brother, a son, an uncle, nephew, cousin, and mentor. To his community, he's a writer, poet, scholar, intellectual, and friend. To the church, he's a preacher, prophet, and pastor. He is an advocate for all people, and none are outside the boundaries of Alex's love and care. His sense of humor and playful presence brings much-needed light in the darkest of places. The mark of a faithful follower of Jesus Christ is not simply their biblical and theological achievements or the number of publications they have or whether or not they are incarcerated or free. It is the commitment to speak out against sinful iterations of the gospel and participate in transforming communities who are broken and in need of good news. Pastor Alex is one of those genuinely faithful people who loves Jesus and advances God's kingdom wherever he is. Alex's is truly a prophetic voice, and we are so blessed to have him with us today. Pastor Alex, on behalf of North Park Covenant Church, we receive the message you have for us. Thank you for being here.
Well, as I'm sure you've picked up on by now, this is a really unique Sunday. And today I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to preach a sermon that I didn't write. We've been beautifully introduced to this sermon's author, Alex Negron, by Michelle already. So even though I have a whole raft of stories about Alex that I want to tell, I'm going to refrain. But we do have one more task left to accomplish before the sermon proper begins. And that task is to give you a visual of this man who's become my brother. Now, I have to imagine that you who've already met Alex are smiling right now, because as you reach into your memory and you pull up that image of who Alex is, you know he would be so jacked up about getting to preach that he would be grinning from ear to ear and like bouncing with all the energy and excitement that's held up in himself. But for those of you who haven't met Alex yet, I went hunting for a picture of him so you could at least see his face and have an image to hold in your mind as you hear his words, because even though Alex and I call each other hermanos, we don't actually look too much like each other, and only one of us has a beard. So I was digging through the incredible photos of our Stateville students that were taken by the talented Carl Clifton Soderstrom back at Convocation a year and some change ago, but I realized I couldn't find a picture of Alex by himself that I could use to help you see him in your imagination. All I could find were photos like this one, or photos like this one, even photos like this. And while this is probably too many photos, I can't not include this one. As I was looking through photos, I'll be honest, I was starting to get kind of frustrated. And I couldn't find a photo of Alex by himself, or even a photo where he has the decency to be far enough away from another human being that you could crop him out and let him stand on his own. But then I realized that these Alex in community images are the best possible way to help us imagine Alex as he joins us here this morning. You see, it's in these photos where Alex is embedded in and enjoying the heck out of his Christian family that we see the most true picture of Alex I could share with you today. Alex, who is enjoying and creating healthy Christian community, is who Alex is. So now I invite us to open our hearts to Alex and our ears to God as we hear together his sermon on Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 2, verse 10, entitled, Our Church Reimagined. Whenever I study a particular story or a passage in the Bible, I like to imagine myself there so I can immerse myself in the text as I'm reading. I pick it apart to find the characters I can identify with, and I separate them from the ones I can't. And then I try to put the story back together and sew the thread of my own life into the text in order to give it some relevancy for today. And sometimes this process is easy for me and sometimes it's not. But we're going to do that work together today to imaginatively read and bring this Old Testament story to life on this blessed Sunday. Many of us have come to know this Exodus story very well. God and Moses and the Hebrews are the characters we're supposed to root for. Woo! Pharaoh and the privileged Egyptians are the ones we're supposed to boo. This passage at the beginning of the Exodus story gives us a tiny glimpse of these characters that we'll be reading about in the weeks to come and the roles they will play in the story. At the point where we're reading today, Moses is just a helpless infant. He wasn't supposed to make his first birthday, his first steps, or say his first words, some of those great milestones we love to celebrate as parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles. But he had to make it out of an impoverished community before he could set forth a chain of events that would lead to Israel's liberation. Pharaoh is this nasty villain, firmly set on maintaining the power he has attained for himself and his own ethnic group. And God? Well, God has yet to make his grand entrance into this deliverance story, but God's Spirit is clearly in our text for the morning. So in order for us to begin to immerse ourselves in the passage, I want you to imagine what it would be like to live in that ancient Hebrew community in Egypt. The name of that community was Goshen, and it was the place assigned to Joseph's family back at the end of Genesis when they first arrived in Egypt. In the beginning, there was plenty of land, and it became a place where Joseph's descendants could farm and be productive members of Egyptian society. But in between last Sunday's text and this one, hundreds of years have passed. And in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, a new Pharaoh ascends as ruler, and the conditions in Goshen change drastically. Goshen becomes the last place you'd want to be in Egypt. Forced labor is implemented, and intense surveillance becomes a constant in the community. In that way, Goshen reminds me of some of the places I've lived in or visited in Chicago in the 1980s. It reminds me of Humboldt Park, North Lawndale, or Inglewood, the Rockwell Gardens housing project. And I want to spend some time at the beginning of this sermon imaginatively tying together the threads of similarity between the Israelites' experience in Goshen and my experience in America. Before I was born, there were plenty of opportunities to earn a living in my neighborhood. Factories for companies like Marshall Field's, Schwinn, Brax Candy, or Hostess gave access to good jobs. But those companies moved to greener pastures, and my communities deteriorated because of it. They became food deserts, cesspools for violence and disease, and within these communities, children barely made it out. They had to be on the lookout for stray bullets, pray there wasn't an abusive adult in the household, and escape the hands of predators who lurked in the streets. Can you imagine yourself living in a community like a modern-day Goshen? Can you imagine yourself living in a community where there isn't a ray of hope residing in it? I don't have to, because I lived smack in the middle of one growing up. The horrors I experienced were worse than any nightmare on Elm Street. I watched a man murdered for adultery, a body burned in a van, a body tossed in the trash. People overdosed on heroin and so much more. When we read this text and imagine what it would be like to live in Goshen, we see children who were just brought into the world murdered by its government officials. We see families destroyed and future leaders exterminated. And the reason the Bible gives for Pharaoh enacting these policies is because he was afraid of losing the power he had fought so hard to accumulate in his lifetime. Does that have a familiar ring to it? I believe it does. You see, I was born in this modern day Goshen where my life was never deemed valuable by our government, by the church, or by society. I was born into a Goshen in which police brutality was normalized, violence ran rampant, substance abuse was devouring its citizens, and AIDS was widespread. And when I tried to climb out of this Goshen, the pharaohs of this nation assigned taskmasters to illegally seize me and plunge me back into another one. This was done to ensure that I never challenged its authority again. Now, when I speak about the pharaohs of America, I'm talking about the three branches of our government. Since I've been born, I and other children of color have been deemed a threat by these establishments and targeted through the policies they pass and implement. Political leaders label us monsters and super predators so they can tally up votes and raise campaign funds to achieve their goals. Then they commission their taskmasters, their law enforcement agencies, to use any and all tactics necessary to neutralize their targets. This is how families get destroyed and future leaders get exterminated in our nation. Now, I get it. Some of you might not be able to equate Egypt's taskmasters to our nation's law enforcement agencies. But if you could imagine yourself being beaten, robbed, stripped of your inalienable rights by them, then maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to see the inhumanity of their policing tactics through the lens of those crying out for justice in our nation's streets and our nation's prisons. I was a person harmed by police officers on multiple occasions. My first encounter with police brutality was at the age of 14. I was just a kid who loved to play baseball and video games, to sing R&B music. Yet because I was hanging out with known gang members, I was beaten along with them. I was robbed of my childhood that day and forced to see the world through a different lens. My life did not matter. Now, when I was 18, my family lost a friend to police violence. Thomas Lee High was his name. And countless others in Goshen spread across this country have experienced these same injustices. And when we decide to speak out, they mobilize tanks and tear gas to silence us. The leaders incarcerate us in droves to maintain their power. But what I love about this morning's passage is that just when it seems hopeless, we see hope begin to seep in. This nasty grip that Pharaoh had on the impoverished Hebrews loosens, and it begins with two courageous Egyptian women. These two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, they're able to see the evil within Pharaoh's political agenda. Verse 17 says, "But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. They let the boys live." Not only were they able to see the evil, they acted against it. Instead of staying idle and using their privilege to stay safe or for their material gain, they used their privilege to save lives, oppressed lives. Now, this act of resistance forced Pharaoh to roll up his sleeves and be ever more determined with his genocidal policies. And we see this in verse 22. And as it begins to get darker again, hope springs up and gains ground. Moses' mother and his sister strategized and organized and mobilized against Pharaoh's evil plot. These two marginalized women used the Pharaoh's own daughter and her compassion against him to resist and expose the inhumanity of Pharaoh's policies. Can you imagine the headlines in this scandal? Can you imagine how viral this act of defiance would be on social media? Can you imagine the tension in Pharaoh's house when he realized he had been betrayed by his own daughter? Can you imagine that news spreading across Egypt like wildfire? What happened that day on the Nile is starting to make its way in America. Privileged citizens of this nation are starting to see with their own eyes murdering that is happening in the streets of the Goshens scattered across the empire of America. And privileged citizens are starting to stand up to the forces that are responsible for the injustices in our land. And yes, for us in the church, it's important to talk about spiritual things, whether that be freedom from the bondage of sin or the salvation that's offered to us in the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord. But these truths are watered down if the things done in the supernatural do not manifest themselves in the natural. The faith, hope, and love we possess spiritually has and must be lived out in the earthly realm. Where the church has fallen short in this is that we've consistently preached a one-dimensional message to three-dimensional beings. The church has hammered home a message of a better life in the age to come, when our prayer is that God's kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven. And the church expects that those who have endured these generational plights will embrace this heavenly salvation message, while the church never addresses the ailments that face their hurting communities. Not only that, but the church has often used its privileged status to assist the empire. It's helped the empire secure this devastating grip on its citizens of color. The church has forgotten that justice without compassion is ungodly. It's diluted God's message for far too long. The church has dedicated itself to praying away these migraines of injustice when God has given us the power to cure them. But this passage reveals a ray of shimmering hope for the church and invites us to live into this story in our day. This family story holds up as an example for us 5 brave women representing both sides of ancient society. They used their skills and resources and place within Egypt to dismantle its systems of oppression. Now, these women can find the courage to stand up to Pharaoh. Imagine what the church can do. Imagine the policies that can be torn down in the empire. I can almost grasp the possibilities the same way Moses was grasped on the Nile. Can you? Do you have the courage to stand on the banks of these rivers of injustice and save lives? Can you imagine yourself nourishing and strengthening the spirit of Moses despite Pharaoh doing everything in his power to eradicate it? I can. Whether on the Nile or on the Mississippi, injustice still flows around our globe. Not much is different. Just the dates and the names of the empires have changed. But I can imagine the church today moving against these currents of injustice in the name of our just God. So now that we've spent some time together, we've sat with the word and imagined God's message, we find ourselves near the end of the sermon, and I have to ask, are you willing to address these issues that plague our nation? Are you willing to use the privilege you have to tear down these policies that encourage police brutality, disproportionate opportunities for education, inadequate health care, mass incarceration, redlining, and other policies that are used to dehumanize the least in our country? Are you willing to strategize and organize and mobilize with the residents of America's Goshens to realize God's will for heaven to come on this earth? I pray that you are. For the time is near. Godly justice is knocking on our nation's door, and it is directly opposed to the justice so often embraced by privileged Americans. Those who continue to root for Pharaoh are in for a rude awakening. The pain that has been brewing in these impoverished communities for generations will be felt by those on the wrong side of God's justice. Now, for the past 6 months, every American has been put through a ringer of some sort. What we've endured has opened the eyes of some citizens and reopened the wounds of others. Demands for justice are spilling out into the streets in the middle of a pandemic. And it causes me to wonder, perhaps this is just one of many plagues that will come before we choose to join God on the side of justice. So having imaginatively read the Exodus story this morning, while in the furnace of our own affliction, leaves me with one piercing question to ask. How many more plagues must we endure before the church is broken enough to be reimagined?
Darkness,